The story is only just beginning, and you are officially invited to take your seat in the front row. Don't let the best part of the narrative pass you by. Subscribe now and be part of the most exciting stories on the web.
My mother-in-law's voice cut through the noise of the dinner table like a blade. She signed it over, she announced to the whole room, her champagne glass already raised. Every last share. Daniel handled it beautifully. My husband sat at the head of the table, nodding like he'd just closed the deal of the century. He looked directly at me and said, "The account was dead weight anyway. At least now the family has something to show for it." His brother started clapping. Then his sister joined in. I sat there and said nothing. 3 days later, my business partner called me, barely able to speak. "There are federal auditors in our lobby, they're asking for you." Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this happened overnight. My name is Claire. I'm 38 years old. For 11 years, I was married to a man named Daniel Whitfield, and for 11 years, I watched his family treat our marriage like a business arrangement in which I was the unpaid intern. I met Daniel at a conference in Chicago. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming quietly, convincingly, in a way that only reveals its limits years later. He came from old money, or what his family called old money. His father had built a regional insurance company in the 1980s, sold it in the 2000s, and since then the Whitfields had lived off the interest of that sale and the mythology surrounding it. They weren't as wealthy as they believed, but they were wealthy enough to make everyone around them feel smaller. I came from nothing remarkable. My parents were school teachers in Ohio. I put myself through college, then through a graduate program in financial analysis. And by the time I was 29, I had co-founded a small but profitable consulting firm with my best friend, a woman named Sonia. We specialized in forensic accounting, helping companies and sometimes law firms untangle financial fraud. It was unglamorous work that paid extremely well. And I was good at it in a way I had never been good at anything before. Daniel's family never knew what to do with me. His mother, Margaret, referred to my job as Claire's number work for the first 3 years of our marriage. She said it with a particular kind of smile, polished, apologetic, as though she was embarrassed on my behalf for having chosen something so technical. His father, Gerald, once asked me at Christmas dinner whether I'd ever considered something more people-oriented. His sister, Brooke, told me at my own wedding reception that Daniel had always needed someone grounded. I spent years trying to figure out if that was a compliment. Daniel himself was more subtle. He never insulted me directly. He was too careful for that. What he did instead was manage me, handle information, frame decisions, position himself as the reasonable one who was simply trying to protect our shared interests. He told me early in our marriage that it made more sense for him to oversee our household finances. He had the relationships with the banks, he said. He understood the tax structures. I was busy with work, and why add stress to my plate? I agreed. I was busy, and I trusted him. That was my first mistake, not trusting him, but trusting him completely, without verification, the way you trust a fact you've never had reason to question. For years I never looked at our joint accounts closely. I contributed to them generously. My firm was growing, and I was bringing in significantly more than Daniel, who had moved between consulting roles and a few startup investments that never quite landed. I didn't hold it over him. What I didn't realize was that he and his family had made quite a lot of it quietly, privately, in the way the Whitfields made most of their decisions. The thing I protected most was my stake in the firm. When Sonia and I founded the company, we each held 50%. Over the years, as we brought in small investors and a limited partner, our stakes had been diluted slightly, but I still held 31%, a block large enough to give me meaningful control alongside Sonia. That stake was mine alone, documented, registered, tied to my personal legal identity, not to any joint marital property. Not because I distrusted Daniel at the time, but because Sonia had insisted, and because in the back of my mind, in some quiet room I rarely visited, I had always known that I needed something that was only mine. I kept those documents in a fireproof lockbox at the back of my home office closet. I had never told Daniel the combination. The trouble began in earnest about 18 months before that dinner. Daniel came to me one evening while I was working late at the kitchen table. He sat down across from me with the careful, practiced expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say. He told me that his family had an opportunity, a real estate development project his cousin was leading in Tennessee. They needed capital. His parents wanted to contribute, but they were short. I asked him how much. He said $120,000. I told him I needed to see the financials before I could agree to anything. He said he'd get them to me. They never came. 3 weeks later he brought it up again, this time with his mother on speakerphone, and the framing had shifted. It was no longer a request but a kind of assumed agreement, as though my earlier hesitation had simply been a formality. I said no. Clearly. Once. The room went very quiet. That was the moment I understood that our marriage had a structure I had never been shown the blueprints of. And that my refusal had just violated something foundational in it. For the next 6 months, the Whitfields held a series of what they called family conversations. I was invited to all of them, which is to say I was summoned. Margaret ran them with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing outcomes she'd already decided on. At the first one, she presented a document. She actually printed it out and distributed it, 1 copy per person, outlining the ways in which my independent financial decisions were creating tension in the family unit. She listed my firm's growth as evidence that I was prioritizing my professional identity over my marriage. She suggested, gently but precisely, that a woman in my position should consider restructuring her ownership stake into a joint marital asset. I sat at that table and read every word of that document. I did not react. I asked for a copy to review with my own attorney, and I watched her jaw tighten. Afterward, Daniel told me I had embarrassed him. I told him his mother had suggested I sign away my life's work and he should be embarrassed for not stopping her. We didn't speak much after that. I want to explain something about why I stayed. I have read the comments on videos like this one. I know what people ask. Why didn't she leave? Why would anyone put up with that for so long? I understand the question. I have asked it myself, in the bathroom mirror, at 2 a.m, many times. Here is the honest answer. I stayed because leaving felt like losing. I had built a version of my life inside this marriage, a house I loved, a routine that felt stable, a belief that if I was patient and reasonable and smart enough, I could outlast the dysfunction without burning everything down. I also stayed because I was watching. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my professional life finding the thing people are trying to hide, and I had begun to suspect that something was being hidden from me. I wanted to find it before I walked away. So I paid attention. About 8 months before the dinner, I noticed a discrepancy in one of our household accounts. A small one, the kind most people would miss. A transfer to an account I didn't recognize, for a precise, odd amount. I noted it, said nothing, and began quietly pulling records. What I found, over the following weeks, was a pattern. Multiple small transfers over the course of 2 years, originating from our joint investment account and flowing into a holding account registered to a shell company. One of its registered agents shared a surname with Daniel's cousin, the one running the Tennessee development project I had refused to fund. I took everything I found to my attorney. I also had a long conversation with my business partner, Sonia, who immediately contacted our firm's legal team. And then I waited. In the meantime, I made sure that my ownership documents, the certificates, the operating agreements, all of it were updated, secured, and registered with additional legal protections. My attorney filed a precautionary notice with the relevant state business registry. If anyone attempted to transfer or encumber my stake in the firm without my verified, notarized consent in person, the transaction would trigger an automatic review flag and a notification to our firm's legal team. I told no one. Not Daniel. Not my mother. Not even Sonia knew the full extent of what I had found, because I needed her to be genuinely surprised when the time came. 3 weeks before the dinner, Daniel asked me to sign some documents. He presented them quickly, shuffled in among some routine household paperwork, in the way someone presents a document they don't want you to read carefully. I flipped through them slowly. Buried in the middle was a transfer of authority form, a document that, if signed, would grant him the ability to execute transactions on my behalf. For a list of specified assets, my equity stake in the firm was the 3rd item on the list. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I signed the household paperwork, the utility contract, the HOA renewal, and handed the rest back without a word. He took them without looking at me and left the room. I called my attorney that night. The dinner was Margaret's idea, a celebration of what she called the family getting back on track. She had reserved a private room at a restaurant that cost more per person than most people spend on groceries in a week. She sent a formal invitation, printed on heavy cardstock with the family name embossed at the top. I accepted. I wore a dress I liked. I drove myself. I arrived on time. The room was full when I got there. Daniel, both his parents, his sister Brooke and her husband, his brother Marcus and his girlfriend, and the cousin from Tennessee, who I was meeting for the first time. There were flowers on the table. The champagne had already been opened. I took my seat and ordered water. The dinner moved through its stages pleasantly enough. Appetizers, small talk, Gerald telling a long story about a golf trip. And then, over the entrees, Margaret set down her fork and straightened in her chair, which was always the signal that something had been prepared. She announced, with visible satisfaction, that the family's investment in the Tennessee project was now fully secured. She thanked Daniel for handling the details. She thanked the cousin for his patience. And then she said that the final piece, the equity transfer that would allow Daniel to formalize his contribution to the project, had been completed that afternoon. Daniel looked at me. "It went through," he said. "All of it." His brother started clapping. His sister raised her glass. The cousin leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who had just gotten away with something. Daniel turned to me and said, with the small, measured smile of a man who has finally won an argument, "The Whitfields take care of their own. You would have understood that eventually." I picked up my glass of water. I drank it. I set it down. 3 minutes later, Sonia called. I had asked her to call me at precisely 8:45. I had told her to use the phrase "there's a situation at the office." "There's a situation at the office," she said. I excused myself from the table and stepped into the hallway outside the private room. What Sonia told me was that the transfer attempt had triggered every flag exactly as we had set it up to do. Our legal team had been notified within the hour. They had already been in contact with the relevant regulatory bodies because the transfer documents Daniel had filed contained my signature. A signature that had been reproduced, inaccurately, on a legally registered asset transfer document. That is called fraud. In some circumstances, depending on the instruments involved and the entities implicated, it is also a federal matter. The auditors had been coordinating with our legal team for 3 days. The reason they showed up at our office that evening, the timing I had known about but not shared, was because our attorneys had filed a formal complaint that afternoon. And federal financial crimes investigators work quickly when a forensic accounting firm flags a systematic pattern of fraudulent transfers. I walked back into the private room. The table was still laughing at something the cousin had said. The champagne glasses were still full. Daniel was talking about something I couldn't quite track it because I was watching all of them at once, filing away the image. I sat down. I picked up my fork. I finished my dinner. Daniel's phone buzzed first. He looked at the screen and frowned. Read something. Looked up at me. Then his phone buzzed again. And again. He stepped out of the room. He was gone for 4 minutes. When he came back, his face had changed entirely. The careful, managed expression was gone, replaced by something I had never seen on him before. Something unguarded and afraid. He leaned down and spoke quietly near my ear. He asked me what I had done. I told him I hadn't done anything. I told him that a fraudulent signature on a financial transfer document had done it for him. He asked me how I knew. I reminded him, gently, that I was a forensic accountant. I had been one for 13 years. I had spent those years finding exactly what he thought he had hidden. The rest of the evening unraveled the way these things do, not dramatically, not all at once, but in pieces. Marcus got a call. Then the cousin's face changed. Then Gerald, who had been in the middle of ordering dessert, stepped away from the table with his phone and didn't come back for 20 minutes. Margaret sat very still. She was still sitting that way when I thanked her for dinner, said goodnight to the table, and walked out. I had already arranged to stay with my mother that week. My bags were in my car. My attorney had a filing ready. Sonia and I had spoken about the firm's continuity plan, and there was nothing in my professional life that required Daniel's presence or cooperation. I drove to my mother's house with the radio on and the windows down, and I felt, for the first time in several years, like I could breathe completely. The investigation took 14 months. Daniel was charged with forgery and wire fraud. His cousin, it turned out, had been running a substantially more complex scheme than I had initially identified. The Tennessee Project had never existed as a real development, and the shell company had been used to move money from multiple sources, some of which had nothing to do with our family. Federal charges were filed. The cousin accepted a plea agreement. Daniel was ultimately convicted on 2 counts and sentenced to 18 months, suspended to probation with significant financial penalties, and a permanent bar from serving as a signatory on any financial instrument in the state. Margaret never apologized. I had not expected her to. Gerald sent me a letter through their attorney that contained no admission of anything but did, in careful legal language, indicate that they understood the situation had been mishandled. I read it twice and put it in the same folder where I had stored all the other documents. Brooke, Daniel's sister, called me once. She said she hadn't known. I believe her, partially. I think she knew enough to look away, and I think that is its own kind of knowing. I told her I wished her well and I meant it, and then I asked her not to call again. The divorce was straightforward. When you have 13 years of financial records organized by a forensic accountant, asset division tends to go in one direction. I still run the firm with Sonia. We are doing the best work of our careers. We took on a new associate last year, a young woman, 26, brilliant with numbers in that instinctive way that can't entirely be taught. She reminded me of myself when I was starting out, before I learned that being good at something doesn't automatically protect you from the people who want to take it. I bought a house. My house, in my name only. I have a small vegetable garden in the backyard that produces more tomatoes than I can reasonably use every summer. My neighbor takes the extras and gives me jam in return, and it is the most uncomplicated transaction I have made in years, and I love it completely. People sometimes ask me whether I regret waiting as long as I did. Whether I should have confronted Daniel sooner, left earlier, spoken up at one of those family dinners instead of sitting quietly while Margaret distributed her printed grievances like meeting agendas. Here is what I know. I waited because I was building something. Not revenge. I want to be precise about that, because revenge implies that the point was to hurt him. And that was never what I wanted. What I wanted was the truth, documented, undeniable, on record. I wanted to make sure that when I left with everything that was mine and none of what wasn't. I wanted the people who had spent years minimizing my number work to learn, at a dinner table with champagne already poured, that the numbers had been watching the whole time. Silence is not the same as weakness. Sometimes it is the most precise tool you have. I am not telling you to do what I did. Every situation is different. Every marriage is different, and some situations require immediate action and professional help that I am not equipped to provide. What I am telling you is my story, exactly as it happened. The last thing Margaret said to me, through her attorney, was that I had handled the situation without grace. I thought about that for a while. I thought about every Sunday dinner I had sat through. Every document she had distributed. Every time she had called my career Claire's number work with that particular smile. Then I went home, watered my tomatoes, and let it go.